Hello, I'm Charlie Fulton, and this is a PowerPoint that I did on A Nightmare on Elm Street and its recent remake. Of course, every time there's a remake on any film or cover of any song, the two are compared a lot by critics and audiences, and our generation who love to compare things are forever wondering which is best. So I structured all of the elements about the film into this slide, and I'm going to try and find out which is better. So, here we go. Now, the theatrical posters are obviously very important to any film because it's the first impression that any audience gets of it and what it's going to be like. And the main difference between the two films is the sophistication of the production techniques. From the 80s to 2010, there was obviously a massive technological development. CGI, special effects, blew up, took over the film industry, and it made for a remake that really differs a lot from the original in the tone because they could do a lot more. And the original poster, of course, it's hand-drawn, it's fanciful, it captures the essence of the manual techniques of the first film. The remake's poster, on the other hand, it's a real photograph of Jackie Earle Haley, the man who played Freddy Krueger, which has been edited to the high heavens on Photoshop, which captures the essence of the rapid advancements of technology and how it's really all digital in that film. It captures the essence of that as well. And I think that's really interesting. You get a real feel for the production techniques of the film just simply in a poster. And I do feel that this one, the remake, is the better one because it gives a far clearer, more haunting and harrowing vision of the film. This one, it's scary and it's all vacant eyes and it's very arresting, but I believe that this one is more sinister looking. So for that reason, round one goes to the remake. Now the directors, the original was written and directed by Wes Craven. Now he's considered a legend in the horror genre. He's directed films such as The Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, Invitation to Hell and the massively successful Scream franchise. He's a director that is very versatile and he's adapted and reinvented his style from decade to decade to really capture what youth wants and present it to them. Like the 80s, it was all about slasher, and he did Nightmare on Elm Street, which I'll talk about, and the effect that had on the slasher genre. And then up to the 90s, when slasher was still in, but it needed a reinvention, so Scream came out. He's an amazing director, huge names, films under his belt, and of course he deserves a lot of respect. Now the remake was directed by a visual artist named Samuel Bayer. Now he was nowhere near as experienced as Wes Craven. He actually specialises in directing music videos, and he had never directed a film before A Nightmare on Elm Street. But he is known for directing videos for Nirvana, Ozzy Osbourne and Aerosmith, among many other names. And yeah, he's just not as well established as Wes Craven, and since it's Wes Craven's idea and he is such a talented director, of course I feel that his idea is best. So round two goes to the original, and there's just a little synopsis here so that you can understand what I'm talking about for the rest of the presentation. It's just the lead role, a socially apprehensive and timid girl named Nancy Thompson and her friends Glenn, Rod and Tina find that they're being pursued in their dreams by a supernatural, vengefully charged killer named Freddy Krueger, and that whatever he does to them in the dream takes effect in the physical realm. Both the original and the remake are intended for the horror genre, with the original displaying comedic undertones, and it can be argued to be slasher, and I'd say it's horror, slasher, and the original, maybe there is some black comedy in there, but that's not really present in the remake. So yes, financial determinants. A Nightmare on Elm Street, the remake, was very successful. It wasn't as successful among critics. it was kind of panned, and it was rated C+ by most critics. It's easily dismissed, but it actually broke overnight box office records on a budget of 35 million, and the total box office revenue was $115,664,037. The gross profit was over 80 million, the gross margin just under 70%, and the markup 230%. So the remake has a massively higher budget than the original, and as such it does have a much larger gross profit. But that said, I think it is far less of a triumph, because the first film was a huge risk for a struggling company. It earned back nearly 25 times its initial budget, and it was just far more prevalent the way it just, on such a small budget, captured the world. But this is not to be dismissed. It did well at the box office, it served its purpose, it gained a lot of money and a lot of profit. So, respect to that. Now the original, the budget was just 1.8 million, which is still a considerable budget, but the whole company pretty much put everything they had into this one film. Now the box office revenue was over 26 million. Now that is a staggering achievement where I'm concerned, because I think that is really a testament to prevalence and the magic you can create by film. On a small budget, they created all this cult film. So many people wanted to see it, and I think that's really amazing. It had a gross profit of 24 million, gross margin of 93%, and a markup of 1,362%. Now that is staggering. It initially opened in only 126 cinemas across America, with very little advertising, but it managed to gross over $1 million during its opening weekend alone, and it earned back all of its initial budget in one weekend of showings, so practically immediately. Now it eventually reached 26 million, and that just tips the scales of expenditure and revenue momentously, and I think that is an amazing achievement. So round 3 goes to the original. Now the technologies of the production. The original was shot on 35mm film with an aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1. It was all shot in colour in a spherical cinematic process, and it had a collective running time of 91 minutes, which is just over an hour and a half. It only used manual effects with no computer effects, because none of it was really available then. Every supernatural sequence, every killing sequence, it was all done in camera. Famous examples of this are the blood geyser scene, where Glenn's bed swallows him and regurgitates his blood, which is here. Tina's extremely violent death scene, where she's dragged up her bedroom walls and stabbed and slashed on the ceiling, all very messy, and that's just up there. Now, both scenes were accomplished using a revolving set, which was a very clever idea that someone had. It turned upside down, it rolled over, so it made it very easy to film that, because she could just crawl up the walls, across the ceiling, and it would all revolve and give the effect that they wanted. Now there was a famous mishap with the blood geyser scene, where it turned the set where they poured it, but they got the shot, despite damaging a lot of equipment. Other examples of their manual techniques are the melting staircase, which was achieved with raw pancake mix, where Nancy runs up the stairs and falls through. And the scene where Nancy sets Freddy on fire, where a stuntman actually wore Freddy's clothes over a fire protective suit and lit himself on fire, quite literally. Now, over 500 collective gallons of fake blood were used during the production of the film, which really shows the manual effects. None of it could be done on computer, it all had to literally be there in camera. So, ridiculous amounts of fake blood used. Even scenes like this, the blood was all really there, and it was all very much in camera, physical, manual effects. Now, because none of it could be done in camera, Robert Englund spent over 8 hours in the aesthetic department, just a little fun fact, and he said he channeled the frustration he experienced being sat there for most of his day into his role as Freddy. It's very interesting. Now, the remake was filmed using Panavision Panaflex Millennium XL2s, Panavision E-, G-Series, ATZ and AWZ2 lenses on Portugal 35mm film strips in Kodak Vision 2383D cinema. It's filmed entirely in colour with a cinematic running time, on a spherical cinematic process with a running time of 95 minutes and an aspect ratio of 2.35 to 1. Now, the effects, in contrast to the first film, are done almost entirely in sophisticated CGI, including Freddy's face, which is not there yet, very sorry. Freddy's face is just here. Jackie Earle Haley had to spend just under 6 hours in makeup, so less time than Robert Englund, and his face was digitally altered to appear decayed, burned and open at the cheek here. All of this CGI, of course, it doesn't come cheap. It's very expensive. You need professionals, the equipment. So that contributed a lot to the monstrous budget. Now, I think it's very interesting, this take on it, because it's reimaginations of most of the notable scenes from the original, but with the CGI technology rather than the manual effects. And I think that is a very good route to go down, because it pushes them just a little bit further and shows you that harrowing concept in our modern framework and at its full potential today. I think good examples of these scenes, which have been drawn from the movie and redone, the scene where Freddy protrudes from Nancy's wall, which is right here, Nancy's death scene, which is right here, and then there's lots of new ones as well, which they've put in there. New additions include a scene where Chris's classroom literally burns away and peels away, and she's in a burned preschool, which plays a much bigger part in this than it ever did in the first one. I don't even think it was mentioned. And there's a flashback dream scene where the human Freddy is actually shown being burned alive by the parents, which is up there. And contrary to the manual effects where a man was in a suit and on fire, this is all done in CGI. None of the fire was ever really there. And yeah, just a lot of contrast really. But I do think that it comes across a lot more polished, because obviously it's today, it's CGI, and it looks a lot more real and a lot more convincing. One can only admire the time and effort, patience, dexterity, all applied to the original's techniques. But personally, I think that the original's take on things served its time then. It served its purpose in that time period. But today, I think people want more convincing, polished shots, and CGI definitely does that. And I think it's a lot more effective in scaring people of our generation, and even people from that generation. Like it's a lot more scary now because it's more convincing. I especially like that they borrowed scenes from the original and presented them with the new age techniques. Like here, the glove scene in the bath with Nancy, it's practically identical, and with Freddy's face. And of course the scene where he protrudes from a wall is up there. I think it pushes them to the height of their potential, and it's something that they couldn't do in the first one. They pushed it as far as they could with the technologies available then, but of course it's blown up now, and there's far more that they can do to achieve that look. And I definitely appreciate the fact that they took from the original and pushed it to the new boundaries that they can reach today. And I think the scenes are amazing concepts, And I just feel that they're better realised with the contemporary techniques. So for that reason, round 4 goes to the remake. Now, distribution and exhibition. The original was released in theatres across America on 16th of November 1984 under New Line Cinema, but it didn't reach theatres across Europe until various summer months of the following year. Now, this is probably because the film was initially only released in 126 theatres, and they didn't have much commercial advertisement. They didn't have the backing of a monster corporation to advertise it on a global scale, so they had to rely on reviews and word of mouth and recommendations for it to really grow and gain a wide, larger audience. And of course that took some time, it doesn't happen overnight. Also, with media not being digital at that time, it made it much, much harder for the film to be sent across to other countries, especially on their fairly low budget. And film strips were often used in America before being recycled for theatres in other countries. So they would have to be in America long enough to gain some kind of fan base there before they could send it across, which constitutes the wide gap in releases. The remake was first broadcast in USA on the 27th of April 2010, but was as late as the 20th of August in some far European and Asian countries, such as Italy, Spain and Israel. But excluding those three, it hit cinemas everywhere by the middle of June. Now this is because companies often prefer to release the product in its own country, its country of origin, and see how the public respond to it, see if people are interested, see the reviews, and just see how successful it is before they venture out elsewhere into other countries and show it to them. This is to see the reviews and the box office sales, that the film acquires. Because if a company just released a film straight away everywhere at the same time and it bombed and no one wanted it, of course they'd lose a lot of money. So that's probably the reason for that. Because of the digital nature of media and the fact that New Line Cinema grew so much and reached financial heights of a monster corporation before its release, the remake hit cinemas in more countries and much, much faster than the original. So round 5 goes to the remake. Trends. The 80s was one of the most versatile decades for film trends. The most relevant to this movie was the slasher horror trend. It was established in the 70s by films like, you had the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Halloween, and very early 80s films like Friday the 13th, all classic slashers. And A Nightmare on Elm Street played a crucial role in continuing the genre and the trend, because it works on the morality play of sexually overactive teenagers and how they meet an undignified end, often because of that, but in a revitalised and supernaturally charged way. So it took the classic slasher framework and injected new elements into it, and I think that is why it was very popular, because it was a trend that was pushed further with new elements, much more injected into it to make it just more interesting. And of course the psychological aspect of being killed in your dreams, and it's all of it constitutes to its popularity, but essentially it's a slasher which is stylized and propelled further. So I think it's very relevant to the trend, and I think it did a lot in continuing it. It not only added validation and variation to the slasher genre, but it aided in carrying it forward to the next decade, and even the decade after that, because it reached cult status. There were 3 main trends at the dawn of the 2010s. There were vampire flicks, slashers and remakes. Slashers have never really gone out of fashion since the 70s. Everyone still loves a slasher. Slashers are still very common, they always have been, but it's always something new, unless it's kind of a bland one, which comes and goes. A Nightmare on Elm Street obviously caters to the latter two, slashers and remakes. From the mid-2000s onwards, there was a flock of remakes fed to the public, actually accused of running out of ideas because there were just so many. Slasher horror remakes were especially popular in the run-up to A Nightmare on Elm Street, with Friday the 13th, The Hills Have Eyes, Halloween, Prom Night, all films that were made around that time being remade around the time of the remake. I think the remake also capitalised on the vampire trend because they casted Kellen Lutz, who had an important role in Twilight, which was the film actually responsible for the vampire trend, in a brief role at the beginning. So I think that was a very wise casting move on their part, because even though the film had nothing to do with that trend, they still capitalised on it, and I think that was very wise. And yeah, well, there were more trends in the 80s than there were in 2010. I believe the only trend the original really took advantage of was the slasher, and it did do a crucial role in defining the slasher genre. And I think that the less trends that you grip onto, I think, the more validation there is to your work, because you're not copying other people's ideas, you're just taking an idea, a conceptualization, and it put new ideas into it and it catapulted it. So for that reason, round 6 goes to the original. Cast. Now, in the remake, the characters weren't only recast, but they were also renamed and reimagined, recreated. Every character from the original is practically in the remake, but under a different name and with a slight reinvention to them. The death scenes are still practically identical, the roles still mirror each other, with the parts they play, their fitting into the film. It's all practically identical, but there are just slightly different approaches to their personalities. Heather Langenkamp played Nancy Thompson, and her equivalent was Nancy Holbrook. They changed that for some reason, and Rooney Mara played her. Tina Gray became Chris Fowles, and she was played by Katie Cassidy, while the original was played by Amanda Weiss. Glenn Lance, of course, was classically portrayed by Johnny Depp, but Glenn Lance was taken and remoulded to Quentin Smith, who was played by Kyle Gallner in 2010. Now, Drew Garcia, who was credited as Nick Corey, played Rod Lane, who was practically gashed because his reworking wasn't so much a reworking as a complete overhaul, and the equivalent role of him was Jesse Braun, who was played by Thomas Deckett. And then of course you had Freddy Krueger, who really wasn't changed aesthetically much, but we got much more backstory, and the role was different. It was scary in slightly different ways. And Robert Englund, of course, iconically portrayed him. Jackie Earle Haley took the reins. Now, I feel that while the original made a point of casting non-Hollywood looking actors, the remake does the opposite. And I think the casting of non-Hollywood actors really made them much more endearing in the original, and again, I think the remake does the opposite. Every adolescent in the movie, in the remake, is played by the attractive, quintessential example of the Hollywood model/actor, and I don't feel that that is necessarily a good contrast, and I feel that the remake could have been far more impactful if the acting was up to standards and the character had that charm about them that we saw in the original. Most of the charm of the original characters, was that they were unknowns at the time. There was like a rough and ready, unpolished, non-Hollywood charm about them, and that kick-started their careers, and it definitely kick-started the film. The second time around, however, they were all well-established actors who were noted more for their appearance than their actual acting validity. And in my opinion, a Twilight heartthrob and a pageant queen just aren't really appropriate choices for the characters that we see in the movie, because while they're freakishly beautiful, they're not endearing like you can't relate to them like you could the first people, because the first set of characters was quite plain looking, and that made them a little bit more relatable to the public, because you don't feel so much that you're looking at famous actors and actresses and glamour. It's just people, and I feel that that was an element that was definitely missing from the remake, and I feel that it did detract a lot from the film. So for that reason, round 7 goes to the original, for the fact that it's simply a better cast. Now, star comparison, Nancy Thompson versus Nancy Holbrook. The two lead roles of each film are obviously vast parts of the way the film's perceived. And I actually have to favour the original when I'm questioning that of Nancy, because the original Nancy is very cute, very charming. She's very funny at the beginning of the film. She looks young, she looks youthful, so it's not too hilarious when she looks in the mirror and says, "I look 20 years old." It's all very funny and light-hearted, and it wins the audience's hearts very early on. You are endeared to Nancy. You like Nancy because she's cute. She's a likeable character, and that charm about her, I think, is very important to the part, because it really invests you in her character when things eventually come to a head with Kruger and she faces him. Now, the second Nancy, while she's presented with the social apprehension of her predecessor, I really don't feel that she lives up to her, because she's presented as like a miserable, socially isolated, cliche, emo kind of teen, but she's not like, she doesn't have a charm, she doesn't have a standout quality, really. She's kind of just like this moody, sulking teenager. And I really don't feel that her nature has the same effect as the original, because Nancy's girlish charm just does a much better job than her gothiness, I feel. She also speaks in a very monotonous tone throughout the movie, and I think it was Rooney Mara's acting there, because I think she thought she was acting tired, acting drained, and it did come across that way, but the monotone and the lack of expression really didn't do her any more favours when it came to engaging the audience. And the original Nancy, at the end of the movie, she was presented as a match to Kruger when it came to a head in her house and the windows were barred and he's chasing her and she's fighting back. She's really presented as a young warrior who can fight him, who can take him on. And eventually she turns her back on him and says, "I refuse to be scared," and he disappears. And I think she really is a resourceful heroine and a standing figure for feminist theory. She drives the point. She's a young 15-year-old girly girl, but she fights off one of the scariest killers that we saw in 80s film. And I definitely don't feel that that's there in the remake Nancy, because she never stands alone and faces Kruger. She has her boyfriend, Quentin, who actually stays alive in this version, and she needs him to help her overpower him, and she can never do it alone. And I really don't feel that that is as big a statement as the original Nancy's role. Now, Heather Langenkamp, she was a somewhat inexperienced actress when she landed her breakout role in Nightmare on Elm Street. She'd only been in 2 very small independent films, neither of them were particularly successful. And after the immediate success of her breakout role, she went on to star in many TV shows. She took up work behind the camera. She actually aided in the production of Dawn of the Dead, which not many people know. Now, Rooney Mara, who plays the remake Nancy, she rose to prominence starring as the lead role in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and she is noted for other works, including a role in The Social Network. Her performance in the remake wasn't massively appreciated by audiences and critics, but she continues to act, and she most recently starred in Side Effects, which is a film about a mental girl, basically. But she's a very good actress, but I feel that she was doomed by slightly off material in this case. Now, in contrast, I would personally favour Jackie Earle Haley's portrayal over Robert Englund's, which is probably quite a controversial opinion, because Robert Englund is absolutely iconic for his role as Kruger. But I just feel that the readapted take on things just does a better job of injecting that real sadistic, sinister nature that the character really needs to have the effect of an extreme antagonist. And he is scarier, I feel, because unlike the original Freddy, he doesn't joke, he doesn't quip one-liners, he isn't a jokey killer, he's completely serious, completely sick, completely twisted, and he is presented in this movie as a paedophile rather than a killer, and I feel that that just does a much better job of pushing him further. It makes you despise him even more, it makes him all the more sick, twisted and sinister, and he essentially is a sick and twisted paedophile. He committed atrocious atrocities. He committed atrocious immoralities, and then he broke the sword of justice, and he continued to torment his victims for long after. And he's presented with this disturbing nature, this complete malevolence, and I feel that it just translates with complete effect on screen, in a way that it didn't in the first one. We also receive far more backstory on him in the remake, with Quentin, who's Glenn's equivalent. He passes out while swimming, and he wakes up, he doesn't wake up, he wakes up in a dream. And we actually see a dream sequence where Freddy, as a human, is chased into a derelict building and burned by the town's parents, and we didn't actually get that the first time around until I think it was the 6th sequel, and I just feel that that strives leaps and bounds in presenting him as this sinister, vengeful killer, because we actually saw what happened to him to make him the way he is. And that role with the backstory and the CGI to make him more sinister looking, and I just think Earle Haley's take on the role just projected him to that place where they couldn't go the first time around, and for that reason I prefer the remake. Now, interestingly, the man who actually plays Kruger, he first auditioned for the original for the role of Glenn, but he lost out to Johnny Depp, obviously. But he went on to star in a lot of very successful feature films, including Breaking Away, The Bad News Bears, Little Children, for which he received an Oscar nomination, Shutter Island, and one of the first real CGI masterpieces of the new millennium, Watchmen, in 2005. And all this was before he was cast as Kruger in the remake. Haley said he was very skeptical about playing such a dark character, but once he got to grips with Freddy and the fact that he was just a mythical boogeyman, as he put it, conveying his sick nature was very freeing for him as an actor. And I definitely think that translates on screen, because there are no limits to this Freddy. He's far more sexually charged in a very disturbing way, and I think he did an amazing job of conveying that. And Robert Englund, of course, the iconic Freddy, he's a classically trained actor. He first gained attention as a lovable alien in this American miniseries called V. Now his breakout role was actually in Nightmare on Elm Street, and he played Kruger throughout the whole franchise in every film Freddy appeared in up until the remake. And after the success of his breakout role, he was hugely associated with the slasher horror genre, and this led to roles in The Phantom of the Opera, The Mangler, and 2001 Maniacs. But I do feel that Jackie Earle Haley portrayed him in the better way for the reasons that I stated. So for this reason, I thought I'd changed that. For this reason, the remake wins out. Round 10, Rod Lane versus his equivalent, Jesse Braun. In the original, Rod Lane is presented as this leather-clad rebel. He doesn't really get along with the other characters. He mocks and belittles Glenn through the whole movie, and he's presented to be perceived as this arrogant and irritating character. But in the remake, his equivalent, Jesse Braun, is presented as quite the opposite. Far from being the enemy of Glenn, he's the best friend of Quentin, who's Glenn's equivalent. And he's still shown with the shades of the attitude of his predecessor when he gets jealous of Chris, who's the reinvention of Tina, when she's having coffee with another character named Dean. But for the most part, he is shown as likeable, and an example of the contrast between the characters can be shown in their relationship to Tina or Chris. And in the original, despite the fact that he is having similar nightmares, which he's admitted to, Rod pays very little mind to Tina's fears, and he only goes to bed with her to have sex and fall asleep, essentially. In the remake, however, Jesse insists on going to her house and lays in bed with her to make her feel safe, and there's no sexual contact involved. He just wants to go there to take care of her. And I think presenting him as this considerate boyfriend rather than a selfish lover really makes the difference in making him appear sympathetic towards the audience. And this sympathy definitely aids leaps and bounds in his character development, and it is all really in lieu of his eventual death. So you warm to him a lot more, and it makes his death a lot more impactful. Thomas Dekker, he's a very well-established actor, and he's noted for his role as John Connor in Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles, and for roles on the TV series of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Heroes. He was well established for playing sympathetic roles, which led to a role in My Sister's Keeper alongside Cameron Diaz. And after A Nightmare on Elm Street, he's really started to break out of that box, and he's been more associated with black comedy and horror genres, and recently starred in a black comedy / horror genre film called All About Evil. Now, Drew Garcia, he was another unknown at the time of the original, essentially. Well, he wasn't unknown because he had been in a TV show series called Fame, but aside from that, he hadn't really done anything, and he wasn't really a household name as such. But he was actually credited under the name Nick Corey for this film and for Fame, because he felt that changing his name would help him to avoid prejudice for his Latino roots. After A Nightmare on Elm Street, he actually went into hiding, essentially. We didn't actually see him in film until he had a supporting role in a comedy in 2004 called Along Came Polly. He wasn't very professional during filming. He experienced a lot of personal troubles, including drug and alcohol abuse. And he said that the scene where he cried in jail was actually genuine, and that he was crying over the stress of having to be there on set because of his drug and alcohol related issues. Now, I feel that Thomas Dekker, who is an undyingly professional actor, just really played the role better, and that the role was actually designed better because the audience felt sympathy for him rather than, oh, well, he's arrogant, he's irritating, I don't like him, oh look, he just died. It's more, he's interesting, he's sweet, and you really get behind him, and it is a lot more impactful when he dies. So round 10 goes to the remake. Now, social, political and regulatory factors. The film has been described as a reaction to the growing trend of relocation to the suburbs. In the 80s, people were rapidly relocating to the typically suburban areas of the United States because they believed it was a better place to live and to raise their children. And the film and its plot of a child murderer in suburbia, it serves as a message to parents that the suburbs are no safer than anywhere else. The doom of the main circle of characters and the fact that the parents can't really do anything at all to prevent it really serves as a message that sometimes parents simply can't protect their child no matter where they are, and I think that's very interesting and very true, really. And I think the film does a very good job of detailing that. Now, another political factor was teenage promiscuity, which was something of an issue in the 80s. The 80s was really the era where teenagers began to break the mold of waiting for marriage, waiting for adulthood, to experience sexual relations. And they began acting on the urges of puberty much sooner. And the 80s was really where the call for lower ages of consent began. And the slasher genre as a whole, not just Nightmare on Elm Street, can be argued to be a metaphor for the bad consequences of underage sex, because a lot of the time, a lot of the killing scenes take place during or very shortly after adolescent sexual encounter, and Tina's death is a good example of this in the original. It can all be perceived as a metaphor. You have underage sex and something very, very bad happens. Freddy is also very aggressive in a demonically sexual way towards the female characters, and this can be seen as an attempt to demonise sex acts for the youthful audience, because when those undertones are evoked, they're repulsed because it's Freddy and he's gross and it's all an attack, and it makes the whole idea seem a lot more negative. And it's just an argument, but I think it definitely has it's definitely a valid statement. Now, the remake pushes the same agenda, themes, and social and political regulatory factors that I just talked about, really, because the issues that were at hand then still pretty much are, but not so much the sex part of things. But families still flock to the suburbs when the city's cruel to them, and teenagers do still break the old tradition of waiting for adulthood to experience sex, and I just feel that the remake makes far less of a statement than the original. However, because other than discussions, there are no real sexually expletive scenes in the remake, I don't feel that the sex theme can really be tied to the remake. And it does take place in the suburbs, so the first theme is still entirely relevant. But as a whole, I just think it made a far less substantial impact on film and society, because the statements had already been made a long time ago, and the movie in general just plays out more like a corporate-ordered scare fest, which is designed to make the audience jump, essentially, than a statement-making piece with intention and meaning behind it. It wasn't designed to make a statement as much as it was to entertain, which isn't really the case with the original. So, for that reason, round 11 goes to the original. Now, synergies between films. The intention for both films was essentially for it to be a horror, and the intention for the remake wasn't to entirely reinvent the script, but to rerun it in a newer, modern-day framework, and all the while put in an updated spin on the scare techniques. The differences mainly lie in the character's name, where the plot's concerned, as documented on slide 11, cast. There aren't too many plot differences, but the ones that do exist in the remake are quite noticeable. Below are just a few examples. How Freddy Krueger wasn't actually presented as a child murderer, but a convicted child molester, and he's presented to have like these predatory attractions to the new Nancy and her friends in the remake that weren't seen in such a overt way the first time around. There are two more Elm Street children in the remake, those being the small roles of Dean and Marcus Yon, who's a blogger that they look up online when they're researching what's happening to them. Nancy's mother's demise wasn't the fiery suffocation as seen in the original, or the jump sequence pull-in through the 1428 front door, well, that's the number, but through the front door. But it was rather a complete eye socket stab, and then a pull back into the mirror behind her. Freddy appears in the mirror, he stabs her and pulls her back, and it's a completely different scene. Chris Fowles, the character equivalent of Tina Gray, she doesn't dream of a long-armed Freddy grabbing her from down an alleyway. She actually dreams of him killing her dog, and then she goes back to bed after waking up, only to find that he's beside her. The bathtub sequence is another thing that's different. Nancy isn't pulled through the waterhole into deep water, it's all just excluded in exchange of a scene where the glove just appears between her legs and then leaves when her mother calls her. The group were former victims of Freddy's molestation and all attended the same preschool, which wasn't actually an element in the plot of the first film, but I think that it is an essential one in the remake, and I definitely will praise the remake for that, because I think that that was a very nice touch. It linked all the characters together, and it really just gave it all more purpose and much more. It felt like a lot more was at stake because they all went to the same preschool, and there's just a much more definable bond between all the characters, and I think it does play out on screen, and it does help the procession of the movie. And of course, the original Tina Gray didn't actually own the dog. The Rod Lane equivalent, Jesse Braun, is friends with Quentin, who's Glenn's character, which he wasn't the first time around. Of course, this time around, Nancy has employment, and the biggest difference, well, not the biggest difference, but I'd say the key difference, is the dream flashback where we see Freddy as a human being burned, because it does so much for his character, and the absence of that the first time around, it made him mysterious, but it lacked that element that we got to him this time, so I did enjoy that. Production and distribution companies, both versions are produced by New Line Cinema. However, there were very significant changes within the company between each year, which impacted on both productions. It was a struggling distribution company before A Nightmare on Elm Street the first time around, and it became an independent film studio for the purpose of producing A Nightmare on Elm Street, and it gained momentum on that movie alone, and it actually earned the nickname The House That Freddy Built. It continued to thrive independently before becoming a subsidiary of Time Warner in 1996. And it was later twinned with its larger sister studio, Warner Brothers, in 2008, ahead of the remake in 2010. But the remake still premiered with the New Line Cinema logo. Craven actually voiced his oppression to the remake. He didn't want it to happen, primarily because he wasn't contacted to be involved in its production. The producer of the original was Robert Shea, the CEO of New Line at that time, and Shea would continue his role as CEO and assist in the production of many of the original sequels, and he's still the CEO of New Line to this day. But yeah, that is all he does now. He doesn't continue to produce. Michael Bay was actually brought on by the assistant director, Samuel Bayer. He said, I want him and I'm not going to work with anyone else. And he was brought on board to produce the film. And he and Bayer were firm friends, and they said that they shared the same ultimate vision, to quote them, for the film. Bayer would eventually go on to produce I Am Number 4 and Transformers Dark of the Moon. So he was very successful there. Now, overall, I would say that the original Nightmare on Elm Street was a huge cinematic achievement, and it is an absolute landmark in the horror and slasher genres. When you think horror, slasher, it is one of the first films that you think of. And in the ending scenes, and indeed throughout the whole plot, I think it does an absolutely incomparable job of blurring the line between the characters' perceptions of reality, what's real, what's not. And by doing so, and ultimately fooling the audience into experiencing the same confusion as the plot unfolds, it does a great job of playing with psychology and the audience's minds and the audience's perceptions, and I think that is outstanding, and it is regarded worldwide as an outstanding cinematic achievement. It's a twisted and exaggerated cultural satire, and it is a hard act to follow, but I do believe that the remake makes a respectable attempt to follow that act, especially when you consider the legion of fans and the love for the cult original. I feel that it removed some of the more laughable moments from the first film, just the remake, like the stretching arms in Tina's death scene and the blow-up doll being implausibly pulled through the tiny front door window for Tina's mum's death scene. And I think those scenes, if played to my generation of viewers, the young generation, they would be laughed at really, because they're not so much scary nowadays, because we're used to CGI and that looks like a petty attempt. But then it was new and there wasn't CGI, so it scared people more. But I especially like that they did new things for those scenes, and it cut away the laughable things that would be laughable now, and it replaces them with this far more polished, rich and effective technique. And in my opinion, the remake's backstory and development of Freddy actually outdoes that of its predecessor, but as a whole, I feel the movie fails to live up to the standard set by the explosive original. The protagonists of the original, I feel, are much more endearing, better casted, better developed, and indeed more fitting for their purpose, which was to contrast Freddy, and really to convey enough charisma to evoke some reaction from the audience. And as I said, the first film will always be a milestone in each of its combined genres, and as the original, it will always be the most memorable of the two, because it was new then and it was the first statement made. So for that reason, it will always be more memorable. But it was a hard act to follow, absolutely. And while the remake did an amazing job of presenting this tale to a new generation, I feel that it will always suffer in comparison. So, for that reason... Oh no, sorry, I'm so used to saying that now. And so, with 6 rounds to 5, the winner is... the original. Really just... I feel that speaks for itself. In my opinion, the original will always be better for the reasons I just displayed, really. So, thanks very much, and goodbye.